All right, welcome everyone. Glad you could all make it out. I don't know about you, but I work remote. So most days I'm sitting in my home office, staring at my computer, and I have the company of my puppy pretty much to keep me company 8 hours a day. So actually getting back to live meetups was pretty exciting. And it was difficult because the inertia of not doing it had set in after many years of not doing the meetup. We actually started the meetup, gosh, back in 2011 or something. It's been a long time. But we've been off for a while, so I'm glad to be back. Thanks to Ted for kind of really kicking us in the butt to actually do it. So that was good. How many people have, I recognize a bunch of people, but how many people are new to the meetup? A few. How many people work here in VRBO or Expedia or one of the related companies? A couple people. So thanks, Rod. By the way, this is our agenda, but you probably already know that from the meetup. So I wanted to thank our sponsor. I've actually known Rod through the meetup for quite a long time. I think the first time we met was down at one of our meetups downtown, and then we went to Buffalo Billiards afterwards, and I was chatting with Rod. And I don't remember, you were either still a teacher at the time or maybe had just stopped teaching and you were considering like switching, and we had a whole conversation about like career switching to development, and then fast forward all this time, now he's successful working at Expedia and all that. And so Rod and some other folks reached out to host us, and so we really do appreciate that. And you wanted to say a couple things?
I just want to say thank you for everybody coming. Welcome to Expedia. We're very happy to host. COVID sort of shut down all sorts of meetup stuff and even the stuff we were doing at Expedia. So we are happy to be back at it, and very happy that Brian and company needed a home. And yes, he stole my thunder because I was going to take a point of personal privilege and say that Bleeding Edge and some of the other meetups around town were instrumental in my entry into the tech world. I was a high school English teacher at McNeil High School right up the road for a decade, and decided to try a new challenge. And I spent a year doing a lot of self-study and going to meetups. I literally was going to, I think, 2 meetups a week for a year. And this was one of my solid ones. And I started off, I remember, I'd understand about 5% of what was said. And then by the time, a year later, I understood a lot more. And ended up going through the boot camp route and ended up here at HomeAway at the time, and now all part of Expedia. And now I'm an engineering manager, so I don't even have to code anymore. I can let other smarter people do that, but I can help facilitate things like that, and I'm really pumped about it. So anyway, thank you all. If you need to use the bathroom at any point, just go back the way you came, go through the elevators, and security people will point you to the restrooms, and you can come back at your leisure. There's still food. Grab that whenever you want. With that, let's let Brian take us down the web road.
Thanks, Rod. So some quick housekeeping. Introduce yourself if you haven't already. We already talked about that. The link is there if you're inclined to do that. And again, I think I mentioned this earlier, but if you do submit that form, rest assured that information is only used for this meetup. I'm not going to share it out through meetup.com. I'm not going to send it to an advertising company. It's strictly for our use here so that we can meet each other. Join us on Slack if you feel like it. We have a little bit of a community there where we chat about stuff. We are always interested in speakers and sponsors. So Expedia, of course, is sponsoring us by giving us this awesome space. We really appreciate that. We're also always on the lookout for people who can sponsor food and beverage and that kind of thing. If you're interested, if your company, I think we currently have it listed as $300 or something to sponsor. That covers all the food. It also covers various expenses, like, for example, meetup.com costs some money to have a presence there, and just various things like that. So you get your name or your company's name out in front of thousands of developers in Austin. It's a pretty good deal. And then, of course, more importantly, content for meetups. People always are looking for speakers. So the bar is pretty low in terms of the amount that you have to invest. You can do as little as a lightning talk. Could be a pet project you're working on or some new technology you're learning, 5 or 10 minutes. We always appreciate those as well. So if you have any questions about any of that kind of stuff, just come find me after the meetup. We'll talk about it. And then this is our first time here. So there are some options, depending on interest. We'll be able to hang out here for a little while as well. And if that's all we do, that's perfect. If there's interest and people want to hang out afterwards, there are walkable options here in the domain, so we can cross that bridge when we come to it. This is going to be a relatively short talk. So if you've been to the meetup before, you know that part of the reason what we like this meetup, at least I will say, is that most meetups that you go to are going to be language or framework specific. So there's Python meetups and JavaScript meetups. Those are great. The thing we like about our meetup is that it's not focused on any one thing. So it's kind of focused on our entire industry. And so we think anyone who is a web app developer or even web adjacent in some way is going to get something out of it. And the kind of through line that we like to have through all of our meetups is what we call our bleeding edge web update, where we talk about the latest and greatest in browsers and new frameworks and technologies and things like that. And so generally we go through like what's happened over the last month or two since the last time we've met. Well, as I alluded to before, if you haven't been to the meetup before, the last time we met was actually, let's see, in February. So in 4 days, it'll be exactly 4 years since we met. So I don't know about y'all. Yeah. It's pretty crazy because, back in February, we were sort of hearing on the news like something was going on in China, right? But, life was pretty much kind of carrying on. And we had our meetup and everything was normal. And then 3 weeks later, for me, it was the Friday before spring break in March. I went home from work on Friday and I never went back, literally, because I ended up leaving that company 1.5 years later. And the last time that I visited the office was 1.5 years after I had left for spring break to go pick up my stuff, right? And that was 4 years ago. So it's pretty crazy. So again, it's pretty poignant for me to be back in person, having this event. It's pretty exciting. What else was going on back then, 4 years ago? So of course, mentioned this, right? Lots of scenes like this were happening at that time. It was like straight out of the movies, right? And, craziness going on with all of that. This guy was still president. In fact, in February 4 years ago, he had just kind of gone through his first impeachment. And at this point, we were still 9 months away from the election, right? That's how far back it was that we were meeting. And this is a nonpartisan meetup. So this guy was also in the news. He was, in fact, the leading challenger. We weren't talking about Biden back then. We were talking about him and Pete Buttigieg and other people. At this point in February 2020, he had just won the Iowa caucus, and everyone thought he was headed towards being president. So, things change. Other things in culture. So this was the big hit movie of February 2020, came out on Valentine's Day. I also remember this because this was the last movie that I saw because I have a teenage daughter. And we went and saw this movie. And then for the next 3 years, never saw another movie, right? Until, I don't even remember what took us back after that, but it was a long time. Parasite won the Oscar for Best Picture, and it was very notable because it was the very first ever English or non-English movie to win the Oscar. Kobe Bryant had passed away. In February, they had the big celebration for him in Los Angeles. In February, we also formally agreed to withdraw from Afghanistan after 18 years of war. So these are things that you probably have kind of like forgotten about, but the last time we met, this was the current news, right? It's pretty crazy. And the Chiefs had beat the 49ers in the Super Bowl. Although, yeah, so some things don't change actually, because that just happened again. So that was, I wanted to do that as just a little trip down memory lane, because again, this is a big milestone for us to get back together after all that time. So again, this is the segment where we normally say, hey, we met in January, so it's been about 4 or 5 weeks. Let's talk about all the things that have happened. Well, a lot's happened since February 2020. We often talk about interesting browser updates. The last time we met, Chrome was at version 80, Firefox was at 73, and Safari was at 13. So as of today, who has a guess for how many major versions have happened across these 3 browsers in that time? Shout it out if you have a guess. 100? That's pretty close. Safari's 4. Yeah, Safari. They do a lot of Canary releases, but Chrome has had 41, Firefox has had 50, and they're currently at the very pleasing version of 1.2.3. And as Ted mentioned, Safari has done a grand total of 4. But yeah, 95, major releases of browsers in that 4 years. And so, like I said, normally in the meetup, we would sort of say, hey, so in the last month, Chrome did this and Firefox did that. Yeah, we're not going to do that. There's a lot of stuff that's happened. You're probably aware of it if it's important to you. We'll get back to that next month or next time we meet. So I thought for today, again, I started thinking about this presentation, and like the normal template we have, like I said, is to go through headlines and industry news and framework updates and kind of give an update. And to be honest, that was sort of impossible to do in the context of this meetup. So I decided to just pick a few random things that seemed interesting to me without even attempting to cover all the possible things we could talk about. I'm interested, has anyone ever used the framework Redwood.js? Has anyone heard of it? It's been around for a little while. It was created or founded by one of the ex-GitHub guys, and it's pretty interesting. It's a React-based framework, as most things tend to be these days in JavaScript world, depending on which areas you hang out in JavaScript. And this one's interesting because, as it says here, their tagline is focus on building your startup, not fighting your framework. I think there's a lot of fatigue nowadays with like build tools and all the ceremony around just getting a basic project running. And so they're one of the frameworks that's really kind of reacting to that and trying to simplify things. And they're, in fact, they are very proudly like a full stack tool set. So they have lots of stuff out of the box to let you build things. And this is kind of what they're all about. So they bundle React and GraphQL in particular is sort of a unique thing for them. And they just had a major release. So just, I think this week, version 7 came out. And so, it might be an interesting time if you're sort of framework shopping or just kind of tired of, whatever framework you might be using and want a comparison. This is an interesting one to look at. Also, because we've been kind of reminiscing a little bit with the COVID discussion, jQuery 4.0 beta just came out, if you can believe that. And after all this time, they are finally done with IE 11, even though everyone else, including Microsoft, has been for a little while. Now jQuery officially is as well. They also removed a bunch of deprecated APIs. AMD to ES modules might be interesting to some JavaScript nerds, or and then, at the end of the day, jQuery is dead. Long live jQuery. Like as of whenever, I think this came out a few weeks back. I mean, before that, like I would have never guessed anyone was even working on a major release of jQuery, right? I mean, I knew it was still there and people were kind of working on it, but who knew? It's like 4.0 is a big major release, right? So that's pretty cool. If you've been around long enough, I think jQuery came out in like 2005-ish, 6-ish, something like that. And I remember when it first came out, back when I was doing stuff in JavaScript, and I was like, oh, wow, this thing is pretty cool. It's interesting. So who knew, 20 years later, we'd still be talking about it like this. And speaking of that, Backbone just had a new release. It was a minor, not a major. And in fact, it was just a few little random things. But again, Backbone is dead, but long live Backbone. Thought that was an interesting headline to see. This is sort of a random one. How many people have seen the rocket turtle from Node? So this is Node's new mascot, apparently. So there you go. The thing that makes it interesting is not the fact that they have a mascot, but if you follow this link, if you look at the slides later, let me see, this actually links out to a GitHub issue from September where people or someone said, have a mascot is the issue, which is kind of funny. But then what they're actually referring to is the original issue from an old GitHub repo from back in 2015, where there was this whole discussion as well about why is there no Node mascot? And if you scroll through down below, you get to the thing where there's someone introduced a little like emoticon art of a turtle and a rocket ship. And I didn't actually take the time to like understand how that all evolved, but apparently that started in 2015. So 9 years later, we now have the rocket turtle. So there you go. I thought that was pretty interesting. Let's see if I can get back to my slides. Oh, sorry. Just need to do that. And then last but not least, this is not a technical thing so much in terms of like something that you would use in a practical way, but it is a technical feat and a technical marvel that I found very interesting. This is called ASCII Theater. And so if you go to this website, every day they have a movie or show that is completely rendered in ASCII characters. And you can copy this. And it looks like today they're playing Office, or The Office, an episode of The Office, I guess. And so if we switch to our terminal and type in that command, oh, I'm not sharing my terminal. Sorry. Well, I'm not going to reshare with Zoom. You'll have to trust me. But I have my terminal up and running, and it's showing a little movie in my terminal. You know what? Fine. There we go. There's my terminal. So we're now watching The Office in my terminal anyway. So completely impractical, but I'm fascinated by the technology and the human effort that went into creating this tool. So, definitely check it out. I think it changes movies every day. So that should be pretty interesting. Oh, come on. There we go. All right. And so that's pretty much the talk. Like I said, there's actually a million things we could talk about. If you think about all the stuff that's happened over the last 4 years, there's all kinds of tools that 4 years ago, we weren't even talking about Bun or Dino because they didn't exist, right? There's a bunch of things that have had multiple interesting releases, and there's all kinds of stuff that's not even on this list that we could talk about. So instead of talking about trying to talk about every possible thing, we're just not going to do that this month, and we're going to leave our talk at the reminiscing and kind of where we left off to where we are today. So hopefully we will get back into our regular cadence. We were doing monthly for a long time, so hopefully we'll see if we can swing that or not. But either way, we'll get back on our regular cycle and we'll start having our normal updates. So, hopefully y'all look forward to that. But for today, thanks very much. And then we'll have Ted come up. A literal TED Talk.
Hello. I guess 4 years has been a long time. And I think back to it, it's like 4 years ago, I was doing TypeScript and a lot of Vue.js. I've done Vue for probably about 8 years. And when I and my partner, David, created Acuity, one of the things that we were having to focus on was we had this whole area we had to focus on called AI and ML. And we needed to spend all of our energy there, not on UI, not on like minor backend stuff. We wanted to spend it on making the AI great. Acuity is a startup. We are currently in a very early stage, but we think we found some tools for organizational intelligence for companies and inefficiencies as they grow. And part of what we're doing is trying to enhance that. But early stage startups are profoundly about prototyping and trying to find market fit. And to do that, you really can't spend a lot of time with the fidelity that we normally need to make applications that are just amazing. And so one of the decisions we made was to limit our tool set. And so we kind of tied one arm behind our back, and we were like, okay, well, let's just find a very rich server-side environment to use. We're using all this Python for AI and ML. So we basically picked a Python backend. And on the front end, we sort of just, let's keep it as simple as we possibly can be and try to avoid building a large JavaScript code base. So really, like today, if you took a look at the code base, and I shared some of it in the Vue chat, the application that I've shared is actually the presentation deck that I'm showing today. So all the screens that you will see in this browser window, let me go full screen with that. Sorry, Zoom toolbars in the way. Okay, so everything you'll see in this browser window and this layout is using HTMX and a server-side rendered Python server. So basically serving up content backwards. But this journey actually started a really, really long time ago. It actually predates the web. And that's what most folks don't recognize. In the 1960s, Brown and a series of universities were studying the idea of exchanging information over a distributed network. And that became what is colloquially known as the primary example of it is HyperCard. Apple released a version of HyperCard for the Mac in '87, but there were a whole bunch of derivations of HyperCard that existed. And the idea of HyperCard is really simple, right? You have a stack of index cards. The first one you're looking at is the screen that you are on. And when you click, you change cards. You click, you change cards. You click, you change cards. Sound familiar? And that paradigm, it's really easy to understand. I can teach an 8-year-old exactly how to do it, and they can build cards endlessly. But we don't have any of those tools around today. Or so we thought. And so part of it is this life cycle, right? It's going from this hypermedia. You're doing some event. You're either loading, you're loading content, or you're clicking. The client goes to the server. The response comes back, and it uses some sort of transport. And I use the word transport here in the sense that it is the format that's delivering the media. And that transport is then rendered back into hypermedia, and that's what you see on the screen. And when you click again, you do this full loop all the way around. And this was HTML 1.0. It's real simple. And in HTML 1.0, all we had was, we basically had links and we had minor text layout tools. We didn't have images. We didn't have forms. Roughly, I think it was 96. And so HTML followed the hypertext model, but it also deviated from it in some strange ways. By consensus, it sort of got pulled in different directions depending on what folks did over the years. And in that sense, today, I view HTML as a partial hypermedia. And I say the word partial because part of it is rich content that you can navigate between screens. You can pull up any website on your phone. That part just works. The base HTML model at the root of the browser, it's perfect for hypermedia / hypertext. That's there. But the only elements that actually are attached in HTML, I'm not talking JavaScript, in HTML are link, forms, frames, and iframe. Those are the only items that from markup can generate network effects. And so there's all these other elements we've gotten over the years, but you can't do anything with it on the network without JavaScript. And I'm not down on JavaScript, not by any means. I write a lot of TypeScript, I write a lot of JavaScript, but I needed to write a lot more Python and a lot more ML. So I had to cut back. Maybe it's the, just cutting back. But the only events you had were click and submit. And the only methods you had were get and post, query strings and form encoded, post. And so HTML kind of has, it's kind of half in and half out on hypermedia. And in that sense, there is now with some changes in some of the eventing, in DOM events too, and also just in JavaScript execution performance, there now is this really amazing period where you could effectively turn HTML into a first-class hypertext, where you can do partial updates, where any element can call the network. And that's where things get interesting. But first, let's look back at what we have today. And I laugh at this because I've been soaking myself in HTMX for 6 months building prototypes. If you look at this diagram, the core model is the same. HTML, there's the DOM, browser, server, back to HTML, render the DOM. Now the DOM is going to load JavaScript externally remote. It's probably going to have a templating engine that you have to build, like compile. There's a build step. There's probably a router. There's probably state and memory and storage. And then you're going to use XHR to pull JSON over the wire, and then you're going to re-render back to the DOM. Angular, React, Vue, they all work the exact same way. Every single one of them. It's exactly the same thing. They have different knobs and they have the door handle in slightly different places, but they've all kind of converged on here's a component, here's an update, here's rendering. That's how you do it. That's how we've done it for a long period of time. But what's different about today than it was 10 years ago, servers are 100 times faster and half as expensive as they were in 2014. Now just think about that for a minute. Server rendering has gotten 100 times faster. And by having 100 times faster, you can do some pretty incredible things over the wire. The Ruby community is all in on basically doing rendering on the server and rendering partials through WebSockets back to the client. Turbo, and there's a handful of folks who are driving that. And it's really innovative. On the Erlang community has live services that can do the same thing over WebSockets. And so there's some interesting tech there, but it's kind of glued to a server or glued to a model. And that kind of brings me back to kind of HTMX. So this is kind of the state of where we are. It's not negative. I did it for 10 years. I love it. It works, right? It's great. But there's a different way. So what is HTMX? HTMX completes HTML as a hypermedia. That's it. It's simply a library that extends the DOM to allow any element to make network requests. It's 14 kilobytes. That's it. There's not any more. It's just 14 kilobytes of JavaScript. The rest of it is either attributes or headers returned from the server that you've called. That's it. It's real simple. There's no build step. I can go to the server and get any content I want anytime, no matter what. I don't have to compile anything. I don't have to run a back-end process. I don't have to write byte. I don't have to build something to compile the JavaScript to then view it. And because I don't have to do that, I don't have to do that at development, and I also don't have to do that at runtime when it's in production. It just renders. We're rendering. As fast as you can, render this content. Now, what you should be aware of is that the entire presentation is a single page app. It's all using HTMX. So every click that I make here is an HTMX call rendering content. And the source code for this is actually in the Vue chat. I posted on GitHub this morning. It's on my GitHub. It's HTMX talk. Grab the link, pull it down. Everything that is in here, I did a push just a few minutes ago. It's there for the taking. Have fun. The weird part is version 1 is compatible with IE 11. Now that's insane. But version 2, they're moving to a modern evergreen model, but they have backward compatibility to get to IE11 again. So this is a slow moving library. It's not the fast paced libraries of React and Vue, where you have to keep track of what's changing every couple of weeks because, oh, hooks landed, up, like now we've got this new feature and that new feature we have to chase down. This is very slow moving tech. It does not move. And when you find stuff, the bugs and behaviors are pretty straightforward. So let's look at an example. I'm sorry if this code is hard to read, but in this HTML, there are 6 attributes that matter. That is all the networking code that exists. There is a prefix hx dash, that's the attribute. So hx get, I'm going to call the path /fire. And the hx target is a CSS selector that's going to target where I want to put the content that's coming back from the network. And when that data comes back from the network, I'm going to use hx swap to figure out how to swap the DOM content. So that reads inner HTML on both of those. But it's also handy because you can sort of consolidate these. When I showed Brian, he was like, oh my gosh, that's like an eyesore because there's so much redundancy. But in fact, you can swap that out. And because it supports a DOM hierarchy, you can actually move common attributes to a common level in the DOM. And because the events move through the DOM, they can pick up the HTMX attributes as the request comes in and as it goes back out through DOM events. So you get a pretty interesting effect. And here's the actual app. So I click and you get fire. I click and you get water. I click and you get another of my slides that we haven't gotten to yet, which actually has the ability to load more content. And so, wow, okay. And then I can overwrite what I wrote. And if I'm out here, I can basically navigate to a page and everything basically unravels backwards. So what is the HTMX lifecycle? It's exactly the same as SPA, but we're using XHR with an HTML transport, not a JSON transport, which means you don't have to have templating on the client side, which means you don't have to maintain state on the client side, which means the server is in control of what the person is seeing and doing at all times. And it is very satisfying to get back there. Like there is a whole class of problems that are erased by doing this. And this is kind of going back to Web 1.0 plus or 2.0 plus. It's kind of this weird side shoot of technology. And so in this case, I click in the DOM, the browser loads, it calls a server, I get a response in HTML, it renders to the DOM. And then if I click in the DOM, it goes to HTMX, which is JavaScript, via these attributes. It goes through XHR, goes back to the server, but I'm not returning JSON, I'm returning HTML. I'm returning HTML over the wire backwards and just putting it in the DOM. I don't have to do anything with it, I just put it there. And so there's no client-side templating. You get server-side templating. You can do some crazy stuff now with server-side template. I forgot how good it was. Well, the DOM is the state, and that conforms to, I think it's called hypertext application of, it's like there's an acronym that represents it. I think it's HATE AOS. But really, I kind of feel the server's in charge. Like anytime somebody clicks, you're giving them what they can do. And if they do more, you react to it on the server and just render content back. And it really simplifies the application because it makes everything orthogonal. I could have every single person in this room coding a different feature on a route, and none of you would collide with one another. And I could test every single route and make sure it was right. and then one person would probably be gluing this stuff together. And that's where it gets really, really interesting. And in our case, we have some services that are exposing ML applications that are going to feed back content, that are going to classify something, that are going to, basically parse transcripts, upload resumes, all sorts of things that we can do that are pretty interesting, but we don't have to worry about compiling JavaScript and maintaining this pile of code that I feel is now holding us back. That's my personal opinion. I don't know what others agree with, but it's interesting. So let me go through some more demos. HX get, HX post, HX put, HX delete. You probably know what these do without me having to run the demo, but HX get, it's a get request. HX posts, I've posted content to the server and I've gotten it back. And understand that's rendering the actual posted values, just replaying them back to the client. I'm just catching it, throwing it back. Just a little baseball, Put and delete, they both look the same, but I'm able to run modern web methods with any element, just with attributes. This is the code. There is nothing else. There's no script to mistype. It's just a URL. Yes. Every element, even web components, every element. No.
Hey, by the way,
every DOM
these
event.
Microphones. So as,
Yes, but I'm happy to repeat the question too.
yeah, well,
Sorry about that. I'm out of practice.
If you use the microphone, then Zoom will pick it up too.
Let's replay the question. I think you asked, is it available to every element? Every element, including web components. So every element. You can do it with spans, divs, arefs. I've done it with SVG, any.
And then my follow-up question was, is it click events only or hover, things like that?
You can use any DOM event. So key up after you type, after a delay, click, mouse over, mouse move. They all work. I'll show you those. But it's kind of liberating because now the DOM actually can do network things with the behavior that we're used to giving. And it simplifies a lot. It like takes a whole bunch of the stack and just kind of throws it away. It's like, wow, okay, this is interesting. And that's where I kind of got into it. It was like, wow, is it just me? Am I crazy? Like, am I lost here? But I felt like it actually opened up some productivity for our team to do something much more challenging. The UI wasn't the problem. So HX swap is how the DOM is swapped out when content returns. You've made a request, and when the content comes back in, how do you want that to be returned to the DOM? Do you want to rewrite the inner HTML? Do you want to write the outer HTML? Do you want to write to the before the tag begins? So you can actually put content before the tag that called it, before the target tag. Or do you want it to be after the begin of the target tag, meaning inside? So you could actually have content show up inside the button after the button was clicked. Or before end, meaning after the button, and after end. Sorry, this gets very confusing, but you see the point. It's more relative. And then there's others where you don't want to return, you don't want to do anything with the returned results. And I'll show you some cases where that's the case, where you just want none. And none, basically, it doesn't throw the request away, but you can actually use parts of the response to update other parts of the DOM, which gets really interesting because you can have updates that don't just update a single thing, it updates many things. And that's the one that kind of opened it up for me in the sense that, wow, I can make one web request and I can update the user status, their tools, their inbox, the icon on how many emails they have, and something else over here, all with one call. So I'm on HX swap. Now we're going to move to HX indicator. Anyone want to guess what this does? So most of the time when you're running requests, you want to display something. You're loading, right? So I click and I'm loading. And I have a sleep on this request on the server side. It'll come back in 5 seconds and boop, content. So again, it's just about affordances. All you have to do with an HTMX indicator is take any icon you want, any GIF or SVG, and simply add the class of HTMX-request, or sorry, HX indicator, and point to that CSS selector. And that CSS selector will be puppeted with that class as the loading occurs. So you don't have to know where the DOM is. You just have to be able to select it initially. And once you set HTMX indicator, it's done. There's also a handy feature because you can do this. You can actually structure this into the DOM. I covered this before, but forms are also an interesting use case because you can actually bundle content under a form, and the form content will actually submit the data to those requests. So when I was sending the post request, there was actually a form wrapping that content, and there were some input hiddens. But I could have a form and I could simply just submit it. And if I put HX post on a form tag, well, the form now will go through HTMX, not through standard form behavior. So you can change the way forms behave and you can make them sort of DOM replaceable. Okay, so HX trigger, this is how you tie into events. So what triggers the event? For a button, that's a click event. By default, it'll use a click event. But you can wire it up to use anything. For instance, this one I haven't clicked, but you see this timer, right? I've probably got some fancy JavaScript there. No, it's just calling the server every second and getting a timestamp. Seriously, it's just sending timestamps. And if I showed you the output, you'd laugh. And I hope you, because it's funny. Oh, cannot. Participant enabled. Oh. Sorry, network. There. Not the console. So yes, we're calling the server, we're just hammering the server for timestamps. And yes, all they're returning is this little chunk of HTML in a timestamp. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it actually works really well. And you can be really efficient with it. In this case, I set the timer for every second, call the server. And I've done this several times. One, we use this when we were processing resumes. As we're processing a resume, the job takes about 1.5 minutes to process in ML. And while we're doing that, we progressively stream back little bits of the resume as we parse the contents and understand more about the person. We actually paint back a picture of what we're seeing, and we build up a picture of the person. Oh, you were an engineering manager. Oh, you know TypeScript. Oh, wait, okay, you worked in Anaconda. Oh, you know Python too, that type of thing. And so we can build up this really rich model for a user, but this delay metaphor allows us to just render content to the user. And then when the server gets called and knows that the job is done, you can send back a header to stop it and redirect the browser to other content. It's super simple. It's not a lot of JavaScript. There's no JavaScript. It's return a header and it redirects. The other case here is if I roll over mouse enter, it loads Fire. And if I type in water, it does a post request and it sends water to the server, and water came back as text on the request. We're getting weird, right? It's really weird. I honestly was like, I don't know. This talk is probably cool to give on the first day back at. But you know, like this is a search engine. I type in text. I have a 5 millisecond debounce delay, and then the search submits. You know, I need to, well, I mistyped. It's going to submit it. Find the Answer. I mistyped then. Answer. It's not terrible. I sent maybe 8 requests, but you could debounce those better by having a longer delay. My delay is probably too short, but it's an attribute. It's not code. I don't have to get really deep to fix really hard things because the events are there, the triggers, and the ability to change content. I just have to do a lot less, and I can focus on things that matter, more UX, more AI and ML. Again, that's kind of the thing. I'm trying to remove a problem by shrinking that problem down and focusing on something else. So HX trigger, HX select, this one's really cool. So this one is a CSS selector for the content you're retrieving, okay? So say I wanted to get the weather off of this particular route and it was nested on a page south. What I can do is with HTMX, I can say HX select the weather and it will get the page. It will DOM parse it because the browser parses the DOM really well. And then it grabs that selector and then it pastes it in. So if I wanted to just pull this article, I can. But I didn't get the HTML header. I didn't get the body. I got a div that was nested deep in that content and replaced it and swapped it in place. And yeah, it's interesting. I think this is the funnest one of the entire demo. This is the one that everybody goes, wait, what? So HX swap oob, I love the naming, but stands for out of band. It means you're pulling content that is out of band of the request that's there. You can include oob content with any request coming from the server back to the user. So if you need to update the user's status or an icon or some sort of status indicator, you can simply tack on a div or some sort of element, give it, so HX swap oob, you give it the result, the resulting HTML, you give it HX swap oob is true, and it will find the element in the DOM if it exists. It's optional. If it doesn't find the DOM, if it doesn't find the element in the DOM, the ID in the DOM, it won't swap it. But if it finds it, it will swap it. And so now we swap emojis. And we can swap emojis all day long. And effectively, notice where I'm swapping it. I'm swapping one on the button, one in the menu, one in the title, and one up here in the title of the page. I'm all over the map, but I'm multi-rendering to different parts of the DOM. And any request that goes to the server can have these payloads in it. It's agnostic to what the client has in state. So if the server knows the user state, you can update tons of things. Menus, options. Hey, show them this toast. It's easy. It's easy. Just swap oob, boom, done. And you don't have to think about it, but it's like, how much work did you save? I didn't have to write the JavaScript. I didn't have to test it. Well, I can test the server route, but I didn't have to test the low-level interaction to make that work. That's all really solid tech, and it's boring. When folks look at this, it's like, oh, this is really dumb. Yes, it is extremely crazy dumb, but it's great in that sense. It's kind of like a really nice fresh coat of paint on something. It's like, wow, I didn't realize this thing was this good. It makes me look at the browser again and be like, God, this is still really fun. Yeah, we'll just leave it on. It's really random. I think I have 100 emojis in an array on the server in Python, and it randomly selects different sets of emojis. Actually, it's a good one to show you the.
Like an emoji slot machine.
It is. The route is called randmoji. If that gives any kind of sense of where my head was at, but as you call these and you look at the content, it's literally just different emojis sitting inside of. Can't scroll dip. But anyway, it's basically just random emojis and spans. It's kind of like, it's really boring, stupid tech, but it works really well. And regardless of where those IDs are, it just swaps it out. Don't need content, don't include it. If it's not in the DOM, it won't swap. It's pretty simple. So HX on. So HX on is where we tie into JavaScript. And this brings it all back. Do you remember on click? And it's being deprecated? And all the behaviors around that? So like, this is a modern version of on click. You basically do HX, HX on, HX dash on, the syntax is actually here, HX on colon click. You can put any DOM event after that colon, it will work. And so it's not just clicks, mouse overs, all sorts of behaviors. So in this case, I have a div. If I click the div, I get an alert, right? And if I want the info, you know, I'm making a request. And so in this case, I'm actually tying into the life cycle now of HTMX. So it's made a request to the server. Now it's got a response. It's done making the request. And now it renders the content. You have full event control to snap into any point. So like now, anyone who knows any JavaScript can basically profoundly like make these applications better. It's very server-side heavy, but on the client side, it frees you up to do the important things. And that's interesting because I know we spend a lot of time, like compiling instead of rendering. And I wonder if there's a better balance here. Let's see. Confirm and prompt. Have you ever had a button you wanted to just confirm that somebody's sure of when they press it? It's like one of the harder things that you have to do because when somebody starts hammering on the button, well, you don't want to order 5 times. You want to click and have some wait behavior. So in this case, it's built in. So are you sure you want to delete my account? It's probably not the best thing to do in an alert, but enter your username. Okay, well, Ted, Patrick. Okay, and what I entered is actually rendered to the server as a post request, sends the data, and I return that data back in a request. So I'm able to pause these requests, have some light UI. Alert's terrible. I would highly recommend using HTML modern dialogue component. It's fantastic. Use it all the time. But again, I wrote this in a day, if that gives you any perspective on what we're doing here. So like, you can do dialogues, you can do any type of modern rendering, any type of CSS, it's all in play. And in that sense, you can actually guard these components from doing server behaviors when you want to. You can slow down the UX or put UX in the way of these requests. And I think it's interesting. It's very, very thoughtful. I think the most thoughtful thing about this is a good portion of the API is actually server headers. You place these either on the request going to the server or on the response coming back from the server. These are the server controlled headers. So if you want to change the location of the browser, it's yours to change. You just send the person a request and send them a header. On that response, they're redirected. Did they delete a project and you need to return them to the project root? Right here. You just send a header. It's it. You can send an empty body with a header and it will redirect them to that route. There's no window.location and it happens immediately when the route gets parsed by HTMX, it moves. You can also do push state. Yes, you can just do push state. So you can actually update the browser URL without thinking about calling the browser history API. It just works. So I can push state in different URLs. You've noticed my URL hasn't changed. I'm still on /. Okay. And I didn't know how long it would take to do it, but really it's just a header. So on each of these, whenever I return the content from this, I can basically do a push state and it'll change the browser URL. now the routers on the server. It's weird. It's different, but it's actually really light and it makes a lot of sense. The browser, the server knows that it needs to get the user there, send them a header, change, done. Replace URI, reswap, retarget, reselect. You can change the behavior if you're trying to swap things. You can change the behavior of HTMX with headers while it's in flight. So even though the content on the client side says do X, you can override it on the server and change the behavior backwards, just headers. On the client side, these are really handy because HTMX is communicating to the server that it is being used. So imagine you have two routes. One route renders this entire page, but one route renders this content right here. So again, not the menu. But if I am running, I think it actually comes in as HX on the server side. So you can actually tell from the server, oh, this is an HTMX request and it's being made from this div. It gives me the context of the client to have the server then return a response. It's very well thought out, dangerously well thought out, actually, because it's like, oh, everything's done. It's like boring. It's like, yes, technology, finally. So these are my personal thoughts. And this is, I know TypeScript. I've been with the web for a really long time. I've done so many web projects, been a consultant for 8+ years. I've started a series of companies and knee deep in it again. It has an extremely low learning curve. I guarantee you that every single person in this room, without exception, even if you haven't coded in a while, could pick this up and be dangerously effective in about an hour. In an hour. It ain't hard. But the thing is, this is compatible with all SPA frameworks. It's not an or, it's an and. It's a plus. You can use this with React. You can use it with Vue. You can use it with Angular. You can use it with JavaScript. It's an and. So it lets you work at a higher level in certain parts of the app and a lower level at other parts of the app. SPA's not wrong. It's just maybe it's better suited for really detailed parts of an app and not the whole thing. Like maybe we went too far and now we're paring that back. It doesn't mean you have to give up what you have in terms of SPA, but maybe there's a better balance. Maybe I can depend more on the server because it's a lot faster than it used to be. And maybe I can use some of those resources to better allocate development teams with content. Like I can better partition app development on a team. That's a really powerful thing. There isn't one master build step where you're trying to merge this PR and this person's additions don't work with this person's additions in components. The only way to solve that is to get those two people pairing on the same screen. And that's become kind of the de facto now. Instead of each person working on an orthogonal route, getting that content right, making it testable, and then basically gluing it together easily. This lets you glue it together really easily. Our client JavaScript reduced by about 99%. That's no joke. The most JavaScript I've written is I didn't know about server-side redirect, and so I would return a script tag with, literally, return a script tag with window.location equals blah. I didn't know the headers existed. I would have used it. And going back, it's like I'm laughing at this. I just throw stuff away now. And I'm like, oh, I didn't have to do that. I didn't know I didn't have a problem. So it increased our HTML size because you're now adding new attributes. And those attributes have interesting logic in them. What's fascinating about it is the attributes are placed in important locations. As long as the IDs stay relevant, you can actually move content all over the DOM and the apps still work. It's ridiculous. As long as you have a really good strategy for IDs, you can do very powerful things. But you have to be careful. You can't have two IDs in the DOM at the same time. And you probably want to depend more on advanced selectors than ID-based selectors, if that makes sense. HTML is wildly underrated. I mean, it is wildly underrated. It is a very powerful tool. But we don't treat it like that. We treat it as a giant pile of divs that we're going to assemble and try to like put an application out there. When really we could do things a lot different. And I think, like, at least for me, this has been that opportunity. Like, I got a clean slate. Like, hey, new company, brand new tech stack. What are you going to do? I'm not doing SPA. I'm going to actually, what I said to David was this is fact. I told him I'm going to hold off on SPA until we absolutely need it. When there's a clear use case and a clear design problem that needs it, we will go there. We'll use Vue. We'll use it. It's great tech. But we haven't gotten there yet, and we're really far down the road. And we keep finding that the things we built prior with HTMX, we actually can make them even simpler. And they compose well. So we've built one part of the app, we built another part of the app. We have this middle part of the app where we're gluing things together. And I replaced the middle part without breaking the two other components. Like, they work totally independently, no breaks, no logical breaks. It just works. And the testing assured that, because server side, we can just run all the routes, make sure the content is right based on the test cases. I can test with impunity. I know exactly what the browser and what people are going to see. And so it's very test friendly. And it supports any backend. So in this particular case, I'm using Python Django. I've used this with, I've used it with Fast API on Python. I've also used it with Go. There is a library for Rust. Any server language that can write server headers is in play. So pick your favorite language, pick your favorite backend, just go for it. It really doesn't matter. This is agnostic. And that's what I think I really love about it. It's agnostic to whatever I'm choosing. So I can switch backends if we need to. Not that I'm leaving Python, kind of love it. And that brings us to Q&A. There's two things you need to know. HTMX.org is the key place to go. There are tons of examples there that I encourage you to explore. The one that really got me was Edit in Place. You basically have content shown to the user. They press Edit. It immediately switches to a form. You fill out the form, you hit Save, and it immediately turns back to the content. It's made a server round trip, but the user doesn't know it's left. And it's actually a really good user experience. It's like for form filling and hiding content, because you didn't have to include that form in the JavaScript, and you didn't have to compile it, and you didn't have to do anything special. You just swapped it at runtime and then returned it. And so there's something very interesting here. The team actually wrote a book, Hypermedia Systems. It is free. You can buy it on Amazon, paid, but there actually is a free, this link, hypermedia.systems. Hypermedia.systems will basically walk you through HTMX A to Z. And it also spells out the why they took this strange path and what it actually kind of means. It's interesting tech. And instead of promoting HTMX with thoughtful, well thought out things, they love to just post memes on Twitter. So if you actually look at HTMX on Twitter or X, what you will find is the most outrageous JavaScript and HTML memes on the planet. That's all they're doing for DevRel. So you can, on one side of you will look at the tech and be like, oh no, oh hell no. But the other side is like, it's actually really good tech. Like, if you really use it, you'll start laughing at the memes. Not that I'm gonna bring any of them up because it gets borderline. So, questions? Anyone? Brian.
This is really interesting. Thanks, Ed. I think you may have answered it with your second bullet on the previous slide where you said SPA plus HTMX, but the thing that was coming to my mind is when you look at more minimal frameworks, you eventually will run into something like you need a grid or a calendar or some component that's non-trivial.
Yes.
That you don't necessarily want to build. So would the approach still be to pick view or something, pull in a component like that, but then
See, I thought the exact same thing. So Brian, your question is sort of, when you run into an advanced component or an advanced control that you need behavior from, what do you reach for? I ran into this exact case. At Acuity, we were working on calendar linking and calendar scheduling backwards. So say I didn't know Brian, right? I don't know Brian, but I need to find somebody who used to work at Sencha and he lives in Austin and has this background. Oh, look, there's Brian. Click, meet with me. Sends you a link that says, we both work at the same company, but I don't know you. Because, you know, it's a 2,000 to 3,000 person company and I have never had a meeting with you and I don't know who you are. And so in that particular case, we send you a link, you click on it, you get a calendar. And you get a calendar with my availability, just like Calendly. I had to write this. And the calendar, actually, we found in the Python standard library, there is an HTML, there's a calendar component that will give you an HTML calendar. We just styled it. And then what we did is when we styled it, we put HTMX componentry into the calendar so that when you click, it then changes the DOM and rewrites the availability. And it was at that point when I was like, do I need a component? Or can I just put HTML out and make it lightly interactive to get the job done? And for me, that was a moment. The other one was actually just the discovery of how rich HTML is. Really great time pickers are default now. Date, and date time as input controls. You get calendar in the browser. It's just works. You don't have to go outside. But if you needed a JavaScript calendar, well, you can swap HTML and include script, which renders the calendar component. So if you wanted to pull a calendar component from Vue or React or whatever, or any web component, boom. But again, web components just work. By default, they just work. And you can augment them with behavior. So when clicked, do X. They're not going to be as deep per se. That's probably a problem that you'll run into. But I don't know, we keep working around these problems and finding there's not much there. Because the CSS tools are now so great, you can pretty much build any layout you want. Any complex layout, even nested, will work. And then it's just a matter of organizing that into a way. We were trying to spend as little time as possible to get a prototype in front of customers, potential customers, to get feedback, to know which direction we need to head. And so we're constantly iterating on features and content and different systems. And we needed to move fast, and HTMX just sort of lightened that burden of allowing us to iterate far faster than we could reasonably. I mean, right now we're just 3 people, and we've built, in 6 months, we've built quite a bit, and we have some companies interested. So like, there's a proof point. If they asked us for something that was richer, I would probably reach into Vue and put an island component, or take Vue, wrap it into web component, and then embed it, and then use that behavior. But web components are completely, in range. So if I had to build a web component, a calendar web component, I'd probably go there. Yeah, question.
GitHub page.
Yes.
And after the Coda env create, that worked fine. Then Coda activate HTMX. Conda says activate is not a valid command.
Conda activate?
Yeah.
I will sort that out in just a minute. I used to work for Anaconda. So Conda is the repository and primary product of the company. So I'm happy to help sort it out.
Okay.
But Conda is Conda is a package manager for Python. It's just a secured and managed one. Not that pip is not insecure, but Conda is sort of they've compiled every byte to know that every library that's included is done the right way.
So activate should be?
Activate just gives you an environment to run the Python. It gives you the right Python. It gives you the right dependencies, and it gets everything spot on perfect.
Okay.
But I can stop by your machine and help you out
Yeah.
afterwards. I got plenty of time. Cool. Yeah, question.
Your application needed for backspace to work. How much trouble would that be to get that add support for that?
So backspace support?
Yeah, if you need to backspace and go back to what appeared the previous page when really
Okay.
it was just modified by HTMX. When I
So-
played around with HTMX about 1.5 years ago, some support was there, but it was pretty hard to use. It was clunky.
So it would be under trigger, and these are the docs. They're actually really good. They're very direct. Every single feature has a full page and examples. And so it's really easy to find what you need. In this particular case, you're going to look at, let's see here, non-standard events, triggering header, polling. Well, the feature that I used here on this trigger, when I typed in this, if you look at this content, if I inspect this element, and I kind of blow this up, essentially what this is, it's a text input, and I'm doing an HX trigger based on key up. The back button is a key. So all you have to do is find its key code, and essentially that's it. So, but that's if you're focused on that control. And I think that may have been where you found the problem, which was you have to have focus on an input control to be able to get the DOM events to basically render back to it. There is a way to basically at the root, if you know DOM events, you can subscribe at the root at the body to basically back, and then you can actually trigger HTMX via that route. So understand the whole browser's APIs are up for play. You have to know how to wire these things together. But they keep falling back to DOM events, and whether you can use capture or the reverse one. And you can also listen on events, and when events happen, you can actually have triggers that run when certain events cross the DOM. They actually support custom triggers. So you might write a little JavaScript to say, just write a little JavaScript that says, hey, listen for the backspace key. Get that working, right? That'd be my approach. Get one thing working. Okay, I've got the backspace event. And then on the body, I would basically put an HX trigger tied to that content. And then you can backwards yourself into triggering HTMX from the back button. Does that make sense?
I was thinking on the browser, the back arrow. I was calling that backspace. Maybe that's probably not.
Yeah, there is an event though. When the user, I mean, you all have experienced it when you cross the DOM browser line and they immediately go, oh no, don't leave. The web page, they put up pop-ups and other stuff. That is done via a DOM event. There's a DOM event specifically for moving out of the DOM and moving up. It isn't the back intent, but there also is an event to trap before. It's like folks do it when you're in something important, you want to save the content, but you don't want them to back up. And backup allows you to put a dialog up, but then the next back would work. You could trigger it off of that. Is it before unload? I mean, there's an event for it.
Hey, I had a question on the, when you're introducing HTMX, you mentioned that Rails and the Elixir Erlang community did this, but you mentioned WebSockets, not. And then I noticed in your example, you were showing polling to get counter. Is there WebSocket support?
There is. It has been moved to a plugin. So you can actually tie HTMX directly to a WebSocket server. When the page loads, HTMX will connect to the WebSocket, and any data that comes over actually gets exposed via HX swap. So you decide where that content goes. So you can do some interesting things with it. In our case, we just don't want to go through the headache of running a server with the right load balancer, with the right polling, because with WebSockets, it has to be an independent domain. You can't load balance through it. It doesn't load balance very well. But you have to have special tech to do that. But It's totally possible. So anything's really in play. And it's also pretty light to write just JavaScript to connect to WebSocket and then take the content and then broadcast those as events, and HTMX would do something. Again, I don't have a use case there. We didn't have a use case in our development, but it's definitely supported. You can look at the docs. There's definitely items for WebSocket.
Have you had the opportunity to work with Hotwire? And if so, how would you compare Hotwire with HTMX?
Hotwire. So have I worked with Hotwire? Not a lot. I have prototyped with it. I have kind of experimented with it. It's very similar, but it seems kind of biased towards certain server backends, and that's where I needed something neutral because I didn't know if we were going to stay with a Python backend. Again, everything's in play in a startup. It's like, okay, we're like, you can't get your sea legs yet. Like it's one of those moments. And so we had to make some choices on limiting tech, and having Python was my first programming language. And now I'm back to it and I kind of love it. And having worked at Anaconda for a year, I got really deep into the community and kind of back to kind of using that. So that's my personal choice, but any backend works. I know that over-the-wire rendering has become very popular, and this is over-the-wire rendering. It's just done on a request response basis, which is the primary way it's done. It's not right, it's not wrong, not bad, it just is. And I think you need to be careful about how you use the tech. Other than that, like I strongly encourage you to explore it. If it's your use case, go for it. But yeah, it takes a similar approach where it sort of treats client-side logic as secondary, and it's sort of replacing whole segments of the DOM with content. And it's very similar to, the backend would be very similar. Like if I showed you the backend of this, you probably have for those who've downloaded it. Essentially, let me close this down. And all I really need to do is show you the tree. So here are the slides, giant bucket of partials. There's delete account, there's fire. Seriously, it's 3 emojis, that's it. Form grouping is just a little, it's a little partial of HTML. Headers, there was nothing interesting in that. But all of the other interesting ones, let's see here. Yeah, so this is that page where I pulled the select out of. The select was this article right here. So I ignored all that other markup and just grabbed that. But it's just a pile of HTML. It's really simple on the back end. And to organize it, we just put routing over that and logic to expose it, and then basically call the right template at the right time and render it back.
Looking at that, it just occurs to me that you could almost have a completely static backend where you're just hitting routes.
Nginx is a perfectly great backend for HTMX.
That's kind of wild.
You don't have to do anything fancy. Like you can save the resources. When I said servers are really cheap, running an Nginx instance is dirt cheap. I mean, it's really a dumb fast server, and it can deliver all those partials that you need. So any of the content, if it's static content and you're generating, this is a perfect way to generate content and then swap and replace as needed. And then you can save your server routing for something else that requires logic, payment, checkout, other things like that, cart, those types of things.
Very
Are we out of questions? Okay, one more. I love your next t-shirt. That's all right.
So I'm going to ask the dumbest question of the night, but the whole time I was thinking about, call back to Brian's talk, which was when he brought back from the dead jQuery. And I was just thinking about, all right, if I had like somebody that knew nothing was going to get started, it's like, I just throw them some jQuery and they'll just start making something. So I know jQuery is very different than this, but like, how would you compare those two very like simple solutions?
Okay, so how would I compare jQuery to HTMX.
Right.
Well, I believe what HTMX does extremely well is integrate networking and hypertext and hypermedia into HTML as a medium. So then I just have to load HTML. And if I can master HTML and I do some light server behavior, I can build some very complex applications. Again, I think HTML is highly underrated. It's highly underrated as a medium because I don't think we fully grasped what it is. It's both layout and data at the same time. JSON's just data. You can't deliver more markup with just JSON. Well, you can't deliver more layout and more screen with just JSON. You have to have something to render to HTML. And so in this case, simple server, if I was telling somebody to start, I mean, this is killer for mobile apps. Mobile apps, web apps on this, they're extraordinarily fast because the client doesn't have to think. There's no JavaScript executing. I don't have anything to load. It's literally just a broker. Get that, get this, replace that, swap that, get this. So mobile's in play, desktop's in play, like tablets in play. Outside of that, like we even tried to put the other hand behind us and are using Tailwind for CSS. So we don't even have to know CSS now. We just compose these tag elements to create the UI that we want. And practically there, anything's in bounds. You can make any UI you want.
So it's like you've
So it's
got
kind of back to
HTML,
basics.
yeah, and you're expanding it
Yes.
versus with something like jQuery, it's still sort of heavy in its own way, and then it's limited, and you have to learn its syntax.
Correct.
Right? So it's like you're going to spend your brain power somewhere. With HTMX, you're spending a little bit with this new sort of HTML-ish thing,
Yes.
and then learn some server stuff.
That's right.
Right? Versus
That's
like, and that'll take you a lot longer. I'm thinking of like people getting started. This might be an interesting thing because if you're talking about prototyping, that sounds also very akin to student projects or whatever, right? Or weekend projects or what have you.
My son's 13. I could teach him this in about an hour and he could be dangerously effective. That's the part that gets me really excited because it's like, what's the programming model for the next generation? Are we going to have a lot more JavaScript? Or are we going to do it with a medium that we can render the whole thing? Because I think HTML can take us all the way. We just didn't let it. We didn't push the standard far enough and we got kind of sidetracked. But web components is also in line with this because web components is using JavaScript to expend DOM elements. Any DOM element can be a web components now. So you can build components and embed those. There's huge libraries, really great ones too. Shoelaces, if you haven't seen Shoelaces is just, it's excellent at web componentry. And those components are literally script tag, use the component, you're done. You're done. It's not hard to figure that out. And the affordances, like I probably see our evolution being, we're probably going to figure out for the components that we need, the question that Brian asked, where we need extensions to do advanced behavior, we're probably going to build out web components, probably with a Vue or React. We're going to create a web component and that's going to go in our bin. We're going to reuse that thing for a long time instead of recreating it every time with a new spot. I love the component model, but the web has really great base components and now it's extensible. And now I don't have to pick up JavaScript to glue it all together. There's something compelling there. And I didn't see it before. I didn't see it until I literally tried to build something. And I was like, huh, how would I solve this problem? Go look at the docs. Oh, there's an example. And then it's like, oh, it just worked. And I'm just like, this is actually quite good. The memes kind of bring you in, but then the technology is like, that's actually pretty good. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. Cut me off. Thank you.
So obviously, we're still around. If anyone does still have questions, feel free to walk up here. I'm going to call it so that we do have a little bit of time to just kind of hang out and chat. We have the room for a little bit, right?
Yeah, we have till 9. So we're
Okay.
good.
So we have, 30 minutes or so to hang out. Thanks everyone for coming out. if you want to stop the recording and then, but keep the sharing on, that way I can put the little